Welcome to DIE RHEINPFALZ and Tüchter's 51 states. Today our topic is Ukraine and our guest is General Ben Hodges. Ben Hodges, welcome.
Thanks, Ilya. It's great to be here.
Thanks for doing this. Ben Hodges is the Pershing Chair of CEPA, the Center for European Policy Analysis, a think tank in Washington. And he was for almost 4 decades serving in the United States Army. And his last assignment was in Germany as commander of United States Army Europe. And in that position, obviously, he was also playing a lead role in reacting to Russia's annexation of Crimea and the events that unfolded after 2014 in Ukraine. So again, Ben Hodges, we have this very tense situation in that part of the world, in Ukraine, but also in the greater Baltic Sea. On the Russian-Ukrainian border, we've seen military movements unprecedented since 2014. The Secretary of Defense of Russia says, well, this is just an exercise. And there has been a drawdown. But President Putin, he said, there are red lines, and I will decide when to act at my choosing, whether any of these red lines are touched or not. And so what was it, Ben Hodges? Was it an exercise? Was it a threat, a warning, or both?
So I think this deployment by Russian Federation forces all around the periphery of Ukraine and continued increase of Russian presence inside Ukraine in Crimea and Donbass was a combination of all of that. Part of it probably was an exercise, but not in the traditional sense of doing a normal exercise for readiness, but instead, given the location and the timing and the absolute total lack of transparency, which is a violation of agreements to which the Russians are signatories, it was done to put pressure on the Zelensky government. It also was intended to perhaps create a provocation. And for sure, it was the latest, if you will, in the encroaching pressure process that the Kremlin uses on all of its neighbors. I mean, I think what we saw in Ukraine is only a continuation of what started in 2008 with their invasion of Georgia.
Well, part of that exercise, you just described some of the details. One major aspect of it was blocking off about 1/4 of the Black Sea. Mm-hmm. What does that tell you about Russian intentions?
Well, it's also important to remember that all of this stuff has not been pulled back. I mean, Mr. Shoigu said they were going to, but they haven't announced. I haven't actually seen people moving back. Reports are that equipment's going to be left in place. I'm very interested in what the Russian Navy is going to do. These vessels that came from the Caspian Sea over the Volga-Don Canal down into the Black Sea, that's a pretty big deal. And I don't think that the Kremlin's going to spend zillions of rubles just for an exercise. Their use of force to shut off the Kerch Strait, block access for international traffic into Sea of Azov, which is another violation of an agreement they signed with Ukraine, and then to arbitrarily shut down about 1/4 of the Black Sea is typical of their use for intimidation, and also that a demonstration that they don't care what anybody else thinks. Putin is not trying to get the Nobel Peace Prize, and they show just total disrespect for anybody that doesn't stand up to him.
So this is about much more than Luhansk and Donetsk in the Donbass. Obviously, it's about that part of Ukraine as well, given the massing of troops along the border there. But we just talked about the Black Sea. You advocate putting the Black Sea at the center of European and American NATO strategy, if you will, to contain Russia, but also China. Explain that.
So when you look at the Black Sea, when it's in the middle of the map, then you begin to appreciate the economic potential as a corridor between Eurasia and Europe, where you don't have to go through Russia and you don't have to go through Iran. Instead, you go through the Caucasus, across the Black Sea, and then into Romania, Ukraine, Turkey, Bulgaria. And so the potential for economic growth, particularly in the Caucasus and in the Western Black Sea region, is huge. Of course, that's the last thing that the Kremlin wants. They don't want nations on their periphery becoming prosperous, and they don't want European governments paying attention to what's going on in Georgia, for example, or in Ukraine, which will happen when they start investing there. So this is about a strategy that includes economic investment as well as diplomatic efforts, not just military efforts. Now, the Chinese, of course, their approach is to compete by building infrastructure, all types of infrastructure, the Huawei 5G, but also bridges, ports, rail, that sort of thing. The problem here, as Montenegro has learned to their chagrin, is that you incur a huge debt, and then you're totally under the control of the Chinese. That's not the sort of scenario we'd want to see in the Black Sea region, where we have allies and partners that are there already under pressure from the Kremlin. One other piece of this, of course, when you put the Black Sea in the middle of the map, it's so immediately apparent how important Turkey is as an ally. Not just because they have the second largest armed force in NATO, but more because of the geographic location as a bulwark against Iran, as a supporter of the Caucasus, as an enabler for this east-west traffic that we just talked about, and of course, to help with deterrence against Russia. So when you move the map, it changes how you think about the whole area.
So what you're saying, if I hear you right, the tense relations we've been having with Turkey, both the EU and the United States, is hurting us in the Ukraine situation. Is that the case?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, look, I don't excuse some bad decisions that Turkey makes. They can be challenging on so many things, but the alliance is so much better with Turkey than without Turkey. And Turkey has been a reliable ally since 1952. I think that part of the challenge, it's too easy just to blame the Erdogan administration. The challenge comes from, I believe, we the West don't appreciate Turkey's strategic importance because we don't appreciate the Black Sea's strategic importance. And when you think strategically, you can't think with passion or emotion. You have to think about the map and what are your strategic interests. And Turkey has a lot to offer there. And so I really think that the administration, I hope the administration will look for a Turkey USA 2.0. So start looking for ways to rebuild trust. Don't allow our relationship to be defined by one issue, the S-400.
Let's return to that tense buildup we've been seeing. And you're right, we're not quite sure how much of that military equipment is still in place. Russia actually talks openly about leaving some of it for Sapad, one of the big maneuvers in the fall. But basically what they've been saying is, well, we're drawing red lines because NATO is threatening us here. Ukraine has been acting more aggressively. What do you answer to that?
Well, of course, this is classic Kremlin fairy tale time. There's the safest part of Russia's border is the part that touches NATO. I mean, that's the one place where they know they're never going to be attacked. Not from Norway, not from Romania, not from Poland or Lithuania. It's just a total fairy tale, but it's used to try and justify to their own population, which is obviously not very happy right now with the state of conditions inside Russia, to justify the amount of money they spend on defense and to distract them from their troubles. So that's part of the fairy tale. Unfortunately, the other reason for the fairy tale is because it is compelling enough to some European capitals that they don't want to get involved. They don't want to do anything that's seen as provocative. And so honestly, it's unbelievable to me, but there are some very senior diplomats in Western European countries and even in the United States that are willing to accept, well, it's kind of NATO's fault. We encroached, we broke promises. Absolutely, totally false. I think the real question is, why does every nation that was ever a part of the Soviet Union or a Warsaw Pact country come scrambling to join NATO as fast as they possibly can? Why is that? It's because they know what it's like living under the Kremlin, and they are looking for the better life that comes from being a member of the European Union and the better security which comes from being a part of NATO, which is a defensive alliance. We have 30,000 American soldiers in Europe, permanently stationed, 30,000. That's about half of the stadium that Eintracht plays in Frankfurt. I mean, so we're not talking about a lot of people. It's just a false narrative about us being a threat against Russia.
Nevertheless, there has been military aid to Ukraine, right? From 2014 onwards. Absolutely. They have been getting help. You were part of that effort. So are they stronger now than they were, say, 5-6 years ago to defend themselves?
I would say that Ukrainian armed forces are significantly better now than they were in 2014, partly because of the hardship of now 7 years of conflict. They built up a degree of experience. The modernization efforts that have happened, support from the United States, from UK, Canada, Poland, Lithuania, a couple of others. But it's not the weapons. I mean, remember, Ukraine was the heart of the defense industry for the Soviet Union. That's where most of the stuff was made. I remember visiting the tank factory in Kharkiv, the birthplace of the famous T-34. They are still producing tanks today. So it's not that they don't know how to make weapons or don't have the capacity. I think a couple of things that we have provided have been helpful based on our own experience. Improved medical care, counter fire radar, which are very effective at early warning as well as identifying the point of origin for incoming artillery. The decision to provide Javelin, I think, was important. Number one, it's obviously the best man-portable anti-tank system in the world. But I mean, Ukrainians could have made something like that themselves with their own industry, but it was a significant step to provide lethal aid is another level of commitment. And so I think that's not a strategy, but that's an important step of giving them confidence. And if you think about the situation for President Zelensky, I mean, the Russians are trying to provoke him into attacking or doing something so that then they can say, oh, we have to protect Russians, and then they come in again. The more that the West does things to signify support for him and for Ukraine, Ukrainian sovereignty, Ukrainian territorial integrity, pushing the Kremlin for transparency, it makes it a little bit easier for President Zelensky to resist those provocations.
You stress that there's no European capital that has more clout with Moscow than Berlin. How has Berlin been performing in this crisis, if you will?
Yeah, it's hugely disappointing. I mean, today I read where the Foreign Minister Mas says that Germany will not support any more sanctions against Russia based on what's happening with Mr. Navalny, for example. I mean, there's just, I can sort of understand it, just not agree with it. The reluctance of Berlin to hold the Kremlin accountable. Obviously, part of this is economic driven, like Nord Stream 2, for example, and there's something like 5,000 German businesses that have connections in Russia, which is not illegal, by the way. I'm just saying this influences in the United States. Of course, our foreign policy is influenced by economic things. That would be normal, but it seems to be at the expense of everything else. And I think there is this, for the first time in its history, Germany has only friends on its border. I mean, only allies on its border in history. And so there's most people here where I live in Frankfurt. I mean, they're like, well, what's the threat? I mean, what do we need to be doing? You know, the Russians, the Crimea was always theirs. I mean, there's some of this kind of incorrect historical memories also.
So is this part of the story of these exercises, these threats, warnings, whatever it was, that Russian calculations are Germany is in an election year, the pandemic is keeping all of these countries very occupied. So maybe we're not planning to do this next week, the week after, but we're getting ready to use that opening opportunity whenever it arises. Is that kind of the story, or a possible reading of what's been going on?
I agree with what you just said. I believe that this is inevitable because they don't need to have a big giant red arrow that attacks into Ukraine. That's not what they're after. In fact, they don't have to add another soldier in the Donetsk, Luhansk region because they're already achieving what they want by keeping Ukraine destabilized by using a few thousand Russian troops working alongside and leading several thousand so-called separatists. That creates enough challenge and instability that it would be very difficult for Ukraine to join the European Union or NATO at this point. And that's before the other 100,000. So the other 100,000 were not about the Donbass. That's about intimidation along Ukraine's northern border, along the rest of Sea of Azov, and also threatening the area north of Crimea all the way out to Odessa. I believe that they want to isolate Ukraine from the Black Sea, and they're going to use a full combination of disinformation, corruption, threats, and where necessary, the use of force. And so I see it as a just a continuous squeezing. They've never backed away from anything they've done. Since the invasion of Georgia, they haven't given back anything they've taken. And so what we saw the last couple of weeks was increased presence, and we all need to be watching closely how much of that stays. And so I think the thing that worries me the most is not all the stuff. What worries me the most was the lack of a strong resistance and by the United States, Berlin, Paris, London, and Brussels. Nobody wants a conflict, for sure. Nobody wants a conflict. But I think we know from about 400 years of Russian history, the best way to prevent a conflict is to push back, to demonstrate that we're committed. That lowers the risk, in my view.
So Ben Hodges, you're saying the situation is still simmering. We need to expect the worst. We must hope for the best, obviously. And you're saying in order for the best to happen, it needs much more resolve on the part of the West. And in the medium to long term, it actually needs a new strategy, namely for the Black Sea area, economic development in places like Georgia, Romania, in order to use that part of the world as a buffer. And very interesting insights that you're sharing with us. Thank you very much, Ben Hodges. As always, thanks for doing this for Die RHEINPFALZ, and we'll talk to you soon.
Ilja, thanks very much. Thanks for what you do.
Appreciate it. Bye-bye.